Hello and welcome to Point of View Podcast, a series of conversations from Kaufman Hall and Associates about the challenges and opportunities now facing hospitals and health systems. As hospitals and healthcare organizations migrate to a value-based care model, one of the outcomes across the industry will be greater consolidation. The competitive landscape will be reshaped, and only the most prepared hospitals will succeed in the new environment. Mark Grube, Managing Director and the Head of Strategy Practice at Kaufman Hall and Associates, is here to explain this industry shift and how hospitals can best prepare for success. Mark Grube, why has the hospital industry been highly fragmented up to this point?
Well, there are a number of factors, but it really starts with the roots of the industry in many ways, going back to the Hill-Burton Act of 1946, which supported capital access for individual communities to develop their own community-based hospitals. And so from that formation, we had structures in place then that became a great source of local pride for the community. It became a real honor to participate on the board of these institutions, and there was just a lot of prestige associated with the local community hospital. I think another factor is individual physicians prefer to have access to local governance versus a more distant governance group, in that they have greater influence, ability to influence decisions over how care is going to be delivered in that setting, and a greater ability to get the kind of operating environment in which they want to practice. And then in many markets, because we've had this proliferation of independent community hospitals, there hasn't been a big competitive force out there, a major dominant player that has basically led to others to aggregate in order to survive.
So historically, the hospital industry has been highly fragmented. Why is it consolidating rapidly now?
Well, the world has certainly changed and is changing. One of the factors is the consolidation that has occurred in the insurer industry over the last 10 or so years. The AMA recently did a study where they looked back at the number of merger transactions between health plans, and there were something like 400 specific mergers between health plans over the last decade, which has led to a situation in which we've got insurers that exert a great deal of market clout in their negotiation with providers. Increasingly, however, we're seeing other things driving consolidation besides positioning against the insurer. And one of the major factors is really the staggering new era intellectual and financial capital requirements. To succeed in a value-based world, you need great depth around care management capabilities, and depth that's difficult to amass in small organizations where you maybe have 6 or 7 executives really trying to lead the change versus multi-billion-dollar organizations that have great depth and breadth of talent that they can bring to the table to position for success. The need for a rationalized service distribution system is another element here, and it's difficult to really rationalize the system in which you eliminate unnecessary duplication of activity, you concentrate complex services at fewer sites. You can't make that happen unless you have multiple organizations within the same ownership group. And certainly, again, the migration of payment mechanisms away from activity-based toward more quality-based contracts in which providers are absorbing higher and higher levels of risk is one of the real fundamental drivers.
Would you say that the consolidation is happening for financial or strategic reasons?
Very interesting question. Historically, up till maybe 3 or 4 years ago, virtually all the merger work basically involved some sort of financial distress situation. Either the organization was really on the ropes financially and needed a stronger player partner to come in and really turn them around and get them back on a good path, or they had some major capital need that they couldn't fund on their own and again, needed someone to step in and help them address that capital need. But we're seeing less and less of that today. Certainly there are distressed circumstances and organizations are joining systems in some cases because of financial distress. But more and more, we're seeing situations in which very strong players are making the decision to become part of larger systems, not because of any financial crisis or financial need, but because they've decided that they have some major strategic gaps that they're simply not able to fulfill effectively on their own. and that they believe that they can serve their communities better by joining a larger system that may have already developed advanced capabilities in the areas in which they have deficiencies. So the mergers we're seeing today are much more strategy-driven, and they're often involving very strong players.
What process should organizations be using to assess their position in the changing landscape you described and whether to remain independent or not?
We typically suggest a 4-phase process to going through a strategic options evaluation. The first phase really begins with education and getting a real strong understanding among the leadership group, the board leadership group in particular, about the state of the industry and how it's changing and why those changes are leading organizations to consider partnerships with others, both horizontal partnerships with other hospital providers, as well as partnerships with physicians and in some cases with insurers. The next step then is really to take a hard look at how the organization is situated today, from a strategic perspective, from a market perspective, from a financial perspective, and probably most importantly, to look at how the organization stacks up against the future core competencies required for organizational success going forward. So how well positioned is the organization relative to physician integration? How deep is its care management infrastructure? How effectively is it managing costs? Does it have a balanced service distribution system in place? Are physicians fully aligned, economically aligned? Does the organization have the financial capital necessary to make investments in the areas it needs to make investments into? And does the organization have the IT sophistication really to deliver on the quality and value equation? Which then leads to really the third step, which is the development of scenarios and sensitivities and the preparation of a plan to remain standalone or independent. Essentially, what that process involves is taking time to really think through the kinds of initiatives that the organization can execute on by itself in order to try to fill some of the gaps that are identified in the strategic and financial and new era readiness assessment. And then the question becomes, are we able to fill those gaps effectively enough on our own? Or in step 4, are there other partnership relationship alternatives that might help us fill those gaps more effectively and or more quickly? A lot of the decision and deliberation right now, I think, comes down to one of timing in terms of how much time do we have to make the changes to be well positioned going forward. Do we have enough time essentially to try to pull this off on our own, or are we better off because of competitive considerations and or just how big the gap is in our key areas? Are we better off taking the plunge and looking for a partner to help us address those issues?
When should organizations start this process, and how long does it generally take?
In most circumstances, we would suggest that there needs to be at least 2 or 3 months worth of attention through a strategic options evaluation. And ideally, the process is probably more like 4 to 6 months to allow for the board to fully deliberate over the issue. That luxury of time isn't there in every circumstance, but you want to give it enough time that you're very thoughtful about the evaluation and you have confidence at the other end that you're making the right decision. This ultimately is probably the largest decision a hospital or health system board can make about looking to join another organization and or actively pursue a process that will consider other partners. So good time, good effort, and hard work needs to go into that process.
Should all hospitals be evaluating potential partnerships?
Well, I think given the very significant transitional and transformational changes that are occurring within the industry right now, it really is incumbent upon virtually every board to be asking themselves the question around whether or not partnership will help them advance and succeed in this changing world, asking themselves, do we have enough scale really to meet the responsibilities of care management and care coordination, delivering on the value equation? Do we have the depth of management that we really require? Do we have the depth of clinical resources? Are we organized in a way that really will allow us to manage population health? And so it's not just smaller standalone organizations that should be considering these questions. It's the multi-billion-dollar organizations that need to be thinking hard about this. And in fact, they are. There are a number of circumstances that we're aware of nationally where multi-billion-dollar organizations are actively considering partnership with organizations of equal or greater size because they believe that the new era requirements are so different from those of the past that they have to get to double or triple their current scale to be relevant in the future market.
That was Mark Grube, Managing Director and Head of the Strategy Practice at Kaufman Hall & Associates. To hear more in this series, Point of View Podcasts, visit us online at www.kaufmanhall.com.